Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in another Novec talk. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. And thank you for joining us today. Our agenda will be the same as in previous occasions. There is a very short welcome from myself. Then we will have a pre-recorded presentation for our Novec Early Career Researcher slot. In this case, not so early career, Dr. Eres Joeli from MIT Sloan. And then we will have our main talk by Professor Daniele Nosenzo from Aarhus University. And as always, 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. As I always do, a very brief reminder that the Novec Talks speaker series is organized by our Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at Penn. We are a research center that enables organizations to sustainably enact positive behavioral change through consulting, research, and training services. You can see more information in our webpage. You can scan this QR code to follow us on Twitter. And as most of you probably already know as well, we have talks every 2 weeks. This is our spring programming. We are going to announce more speakers soon. All our talks are on Thursdays at 1 p.m. New York and Philadelphia time. And the next talk will be our first hybrid talk. It will take place both face-to-face here at Penn and also on Zoom for people that are not here. We will have Dr. Kai Ruggeri from Columbia University. For more information, visit this link or scan the QR code. As you know, we have a public calendar, we have email reminders, and yeah, you can access those there. And a very short reminder as well, we are soon launching a blog, and we are continuously welcoming contributions. So if you want to propose a short pitch of a blog post, please scan this QR code or follow this link. I will copy it in the chat later. And if you'd like to subscribe to our monthly center bulletin, please follow the other QR code or the other link. I will also copy it in the chat. Our center bulletin has lots of news every month about what our members are doing, what they are publishing, where they are speaking, and so on. A few ground rules. If this is the first time that you're joining, please mute yourself if you're not muted. If you can, please keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. For questions, you can either use the chat during the talk or the raise hand function at the end. And the talk is being transmitted live on Facebook right now. And all the recordings of our talks, including this one, are regularly uploaded in our website. We have more than 20 talks at this point, I think. So feel free to go there to explore more. With that, I am introducing our early career researcher slot for today, which is Eres Joeli, a research scientist from MIT Sloan School of Management. The talk is called Global Behaviors, Perceptions, and the Emergence of Social Norms at the Onset of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Let me share my screen, my video. Okay, here it is.
Hi, my name is Erez, and I'm going to talk to you today about a paper that we just put out a couple of weeks ago that explores the role of social norms in promoting behaviors that help to slow the spread of COVID-19 at the onset of the pandemic back in March and April of 2020. The paper was written by a very large team led by Jan Yemichovich. At the onset of the pandemic, the team wrote a survey and launched it on social media and with the help of media platforms, and was able to get it to go viral. Ultimately, it garnered about 110,000 participants across 175 countries. And that data is publicly available at the link that you see over there. The question that we're going to explore is the extent to which people were motivated to engage in behaviors like social distancing and closing businesses and washing their hands more as a result of social norms. Now, it's obviously not a big surprise to most people in this audience that social norms might play a role here. After all, there's a very large literature suggesting that they help to motivate pro-social behaviors in a variety of contexts. But this was the very beginning of the pandemic, and it is a question as to whether they can arise in time to help out with something that's moving so fast. On the other hand, governments were also not moving especially quickly. And so if we stood a chance of doing anything, then maybe social norms were our best bet. The way we explored this was by taking a look at two measures of normative beliefs, first order injunctive beliefs and second order injunctive beliefs. What do you think? Should people in your country, say, cancel their participation at social gatherings? Or how many of 100 people in your country do you believe think that this is what should be done? And so we took a look at this for a variety of different behaviors. And the first question we asked is, do people actually hold these normative beliefs? The answer is very much yes. These are the numbers on average in our data for 4 different abatement behaviors: stopping social gatherings, not shaking hands, closing stores, and introducing a curfew. And what you see is that first order injunctive beliefs are very high in our sample. They're a bit lower when we look at second order injunctive beliefs, but still quite high. We can look at these data across countries, and what we find is that in most countries we look at, injunctive beliefs are very high, both first order and second order. Again, first order being higher. But if you look at, say, first order beliefs, most countries, more than 70% of people are telling us that they believe that people should engage in these behaviors already a few weeks into the pandemic. And so people do seem to have adopted those normative beliefs very early on. We also find that those two measures are very highly correlated, which one would expect maybe in general, but also if one thinks that social norms are playing a role here, because one would expect second order beliefs, what one thinks others think, to be shaping first order beliefs, what one thinks oneself. Next thing we do is take a look at the relationship between these beliefs and behaviors. We have a variety of self-reports of behavior. To what extent do the following statements describe your behavior in the past week? I stayed home, I did not attend social gatherings, kept a social distance, etc. And we take these and we both look at them independently and also as an index. Like others, we find that people self-report having engaged in these behaviors at very high rates. And that's true again when we look across countries, that in most countries that was true. When it comes to looking at that and the relationship with normative beliefs, what we find is that first order and second order injunctive beliefs are very strongly correlated with self-reports of adherence. That's true even when we control for other things that we surveyed people about. It's true even when we include risk measures, the degree to which people are at risk from COVID. In fact, the correlations are the strongest that we find amongst all the things that we surveyed people for. And that's even true when we include both first order and second order beliefs in the regression. I think for me, perhaps the most interesting result in the paper is the fact that second order beliefs, even holding constant people's first order beliefs, are highly predictive of adhering to containment measures. To me, that's very good evidence that social norms are playing an important role. There's a ton more in the paper. There is an exploration of people's satisfaction with the government and others' response and the relationship between that and social norms. There's an exploration of the effect of lockdowns. There's also an exploration of how people's mental health responded to the pandemic and to lockdowns, because our team was very strong on that particular dimension as well. If you're interested in any of these things, I really recommend you take a look at the draft, and we're also very much looking forward to what you guys are able to do with the data. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Eres, for the great presentation. Yeah, as in previous occasions, unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions, but Eres is in the audience, so please feel free to write any questions, comments, or anything in the chat. And with that, I can introduce our main speaker for today, Professor Daniele Nosenzo. He's a professor at the Department of Economics and Business Economics at Aarhus University and a member of the Center for Integrative Business Psychology. His main research interests are in the areas of behavioral and experimental economics, particularly in topics such as social norm compliance, truth-telling, and the study of positive and negative incentives. The talk for today is called Equal Before the Expressive Power of Law. And we have a co-author in the audience, Professor Sylvia Sonderegger from the University of Nottingham. And the moderator will be Dr. Alex Spenev, a senior data research scientist here at the Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. As always, feel free to ask any questions on the chat, and Professor Sonderegger will be discussing there, and there will be time at the end as well. So thank you so much, Professor Nosenzo, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And so let me share my screen. Let's see if this works. So you should see this full screen now, right? Yeah, okay, very good. So yeah, so thanks a lot for inviting me to this forum, which of course is very fitting given the topic of this paper. So this is a joint work with Louis Görges, Tom Lane, and Sylvia Sonderegger. Sylvia is here in the audience. So what we are trying to do in this paper is we're trying to propose and test a new explanation for the existence of differences in crime rates across different subgroups of the population. In particular, we will focus on gender and race. The explanation we propose is one where sort of relies on the idea that laws affect behavior not just through material incentives, but also because they create a stigma around illegal behavior. This has been called in the literature sometimes the expressive power of law. This is the power of law to shape the social norms in a society. And in the social norms here, I mean specifically, the stigma and honor that accrue to individuals for taking behaviors that are illegal or legal. So in the paper, we sort of, and I hope I'll convince you today that there are good theoretical reasons to expect this expressive power of law to be heterogeneous across subgroups of the population. So for example, a DUI law against drink driving might create a stronger stigma against this type of behavior for women than for men. And if that's the case, and this is the crucial sort of part of the argument, then this means that women and men will face different social incentives when it comes to this type of behavior, even if the material incentives of the law are the same. So women will be more stigmatized if they break the law and they are caught drink driving than men. And this could explain why we do observe differences in crime rates across these two groups or across other groups. So that's sort of in a nutshell, the key idea of the paper. And we're going to test this experimentally using a series of vignette experiments. So we think this is interesting because it could explain this gap that exists between the principle of equality before the law, which is sort of accepted by most constitutions in the world, and the actual data that we see coming from crime statistics that tell us that there are large and persistent differences between different subgroups of the population, the way they are treated by the criminal justice system. So in many countries, including the US, we do see large racial and gender differences in the way that the criminal justice system treats these different groups. So for example, in the US, we typically see Blacks being overrepresented relative to whites in terms of arrests, prosecutions, convictions, and incarcerations, and women being underrepresented relative to men. And this sort of suggests that there's there is a gap between the principle of equality before the law and actually what happens in practice. And so people have been thinking, what could explain this? Why do we see some groups systematically overrepresented and other underrepresented throughout the various steps of the criminal justice system? And of course, a first order explanation is that there's discrimination. And this, sometimes takes the form of actually laws that are discriminatory in the sense that they set different standards for different groups. We don't have to go too far back in our past to find examples of such laws. But even when the law sort of does not set different standards for different groups, the application of the law could be used differently across different groups, and so law enforcement could apply the law in different ways, and could lead to different conviction rates for different groups. So that's an explanation that has been explored in the literature. There are several papers that show evidence that part of this gap could be explained by this. Another explanation discussed in the literature, this goes back to Becker's models of crime. So here is the idea that differences in socioeconomic status lead to differences in the relative cost and benefits of breaking the law. And so if different groups are systematically associated with different socioeconomic status, then they will have different incentives, material incentives, to break the law. And this can explain why we see some groups overrepresented and others underrepresented. So that's another explanation. The one that we propose in this paper is different, is complementary to these two, but is a different and is novel as far as we are aware. And as I said, this relies on this idea that law discipline behavior, not just through material incentives, that the law creates some social incentives against illegal behavior and in favor of legal behavior, what we call, what has been called the expressive power of law. And the point we are making in this paper is that this expressive power of law may differ across racial and gender groups. So in the paper, we have a formal theoretical model where we show how this can happen. I won't show you the model, the formal model in this talk, but I'll try to give you the intuition as to what's going on and why we think that this is a possible explanation. So the way that we think about this is through a model of social norms in the spirit of Benabou and Tirole, the type of models of social esteem, social norms that they have been working on for many years now. So these are models where individuals have utility that comes from material payoffs and psychological payoffs. And these psychological payoffs are defined in terms of prosociality. So you get more or less utility depending on whether you are behaving prosocially towards others or not. And importantly, also the utility, psychological utility also comes from the inferences that others make about your prosociality upon observing your action. So this is what is called the social esteem that accrues to you depending on how you behave. And we can think of social norms as functions that express the esteem that is associated with a specific behavior. So if you behave in a certain way, people will give you some level of social esteem, and the social norm you can think of as a function that tells for each behavior what level of social esteem you receive. Now, in the context of this model, or in this framework, we can sort of think quite naturally about how the law can have expressive power. And a way to think about this is that laws make observable, make visible behaviors that are otherwise hidden. And that's because if you break a law, if you commit a crime, this goes on your criminal record, and your criminal record will inform future audiences that might not have directly observed you taking that specific action that led to a crime, but they will still be able to see through your criminal record that you took that behavior. And so they can update their beliefs about your prosociality based on observing the criminal record and what is written in your criminal record. So this creates a payoff discontinuity in between behaviors that are legal and behaviors that are illegal. You only get a criminal record if you commit a crime. So there is a payoff discontinuity in the sense that there is a different level of visibility for behaviors that are illegal compared to behaviors that are legal. And this payoff discontinuity translates in a discontinuity in the social esteem that is associated with legal or illegal behavior. What that means is that someone who takes an action that is just legal will receive esteem that is discontinuously different from someone who takes an action that is just illegal. And that's because the person who takes the illegal behavior is prepared to do so, knowing that the payoff for the payoffs for taking an action that is illegal are discontinuously different from taking an action that is just legal. So this is we have a companion paper with Sylvia and Tom, where we make this argument formally, and we show through experiments that indeed laws shape norms in this way. They create discontinuities in norm functions around the legal thresholds or the legal behavior. In this paper that I'm presenting today, we extend this argument further, and we argue that in settings in which people can observe some visible characteristics of the person that they are evaluating, it is quite natural to think that the inferences about prosociality may depend not only on the actions that the individual take, but also on these visible characteristics, for example, their gender and their race. And then in the paper, we show that if this is the case, so if people update their belief about the person's prosociality and therefore the esteem that they give to the person, also based on these visible characteristics, then it is the result of this will be that the expressive power of the law will be different across different subgroups of the population. This can happen through different mechanisms. For example, people might have different priors about the distribution of prosociality, say between men and women. They might have different priors about the cost of breaking the law for men and women, or the criminal records may be differently noisy for men and women, say. So, for example, imagine that it is known that law enforcement discriminate against a specific group, say Black Americans, then the criminal record is a noisier signal for a person that is discriminated against, because people will know that there are more wrongful convictions for Blacks compared to whites. And if that's the case, then people will make less adverse inferences upon observing law breaking by members of that group. So the inferences that people make upon observing a given behavior will be different depending on in this case, in this example, the race of the person, because of the different noisiness of the criminal record signal. Now, the crucial point here is that if this happens, the social incentives that people face will be different. So if you are in a group where taking a criminal action is not as stigmatized as another group, then this means that compared to the other group, your social incentive for breaking the law are more favorable. So you don't get penalized so much for breaking the law. And so this can explain this gap that I was telling you at the beginning between the criminal justice outcomes between different groups, because the social incentives that are created by the expressive power of law are different for these different groups. So that's the sort of key idea that we want to test in the paper. So our aim is to show the key argument here, which is that for the same behavior and the same law, the norms that regulate that behavior are different for men and women or for Black American and white American in this specific application. So let me tell you how we did it. So our design is based on 3 pillars. So first of all, we need a method to measure social norms. And so there's the appropriateness or inappropriateness of behaviors that are legal or illegal. So I'll tell you about how we do that. The second pillar is we need an empirical strategy to identify this influence of law on norms. This is not trivial because norms and laws, or more generally formal institutions, co-evolve. So it's hard to come up with empirical strategies that causally identify the influence of laws on norms. You cannot exploit things like changes in laws because you cannot exclude that that change in the law came about because there was a change in the social norm. So you always have this problem of reverse causality. So I'll tell you how we solve this. And then finally, and this is the key part for this paper, we have treatment manipulations where we vary essentially the gender or the race of the person taking a certain behavior to study whether the influence of the law on the norms varies with the gender or the race of the person taking a certain behavior. So how do we measure norms? Measure norms using the Krupka-Weber method. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this method. So this is a method where participants read some hypothetical situation, a vignette, in which a person behaves in a particular way. And then people are told, they're instructed to rate the appropriateness of that behavior on a scale that goes from very appropriate to very inappropriate. And they are paid to rate the behavior in the same way as most other participants who are evaluating the same vignette as themselves. So this creates a game, a coordination game. And the argument here is that participants will solve this game using the social norm as a coordination device. So they will think about what is the appropriateness of a certain behavior as a way to solve the coordination game. And if they do that, then when you look at the ratings in this Krupka-Weber task, then you can infer what is the underlying norm. So that's sort of the way that we measure these norm functions. We do this for a range of behaviors. So we measure the norms that apply to a range of behaviors. All these behaviors have one thing in common, and the thing in common is that these are behaviors regulated by law, and they are regulated by law in a specific way. They are regulated through legal thresholds. What does it mean? It means that we are studying behaviors where there are laws that says behavior above a certain threshold or below a certain threshold is legal, and the reverse is illegal. So, for example, there are laws that regulate what is legal or illegal based on age. Legal age for drinking, for example, that defines a threshold above which drinking becomes legal and below which it is illegal. Driving speed, blood alcohol concentration for the DUI case that I made at the beginning. So these are all examples of behaviors that are regulated by legal thresholds. So why do we focus on these behaviors? It's because we think that in this context, it's actually not difficult to find a strategy to estimate the influence of law on norms. So that's because while we cannot rule out that, say, a law about drink driving is not independent from the norm, the underlying norm, the underlying sentiment in society about how sort of normatively sort of bad is to drink and drive, we can exploit the position of the threshold as our identification strategy. And we can do this in a way similar to the regression discontinuity design, the local randomization assumption in regression discontinuity design. We can assume that the actions that are very close to the legal thresholds, but on different sides of it, are virtually identical to one another, except for their legal status. So let me make you an example. So again, think about these drink driving laws that say, for example, set the legal limit for, in terms of blood alcohol concentration to 0.08%. What we are assuming is that an action of drink driving with the 0.079% blood alcohol in your blood or 0.081% are virtually identical except for their legal status. So other than their legal status, we're assuming that all other factors that may matter from the point of view of a normative consideration, so for example, how dangerous it is to drive with that specific concentration of alcohol in your blood, the possible externalities and so on, they are not sharply different between these two actions, 0.079 and 0.081. So that means that if we do see a discontinuity in terms of normative evaluation of behavior at the legal threshold, then we can attribute that discontinuity to the causal influence of the legal status on the norm. So let me draw a graph just to illustrate this, this point, because it's central to our identification. So this is, say, a hypothetical graph for a norm function for, say, the DUI case. So this tells you for each possible level of alcohol concentration in your blood, how appropriate it is that you are driving. And of course, you can imagine that this is a decreasing function. The more intoxicated you are, the more inappropriate it is that you drive. We are assuming that if there is no law regulating drink driving, this function should be continuous. Actions that are very close to one another shouldn't be evaluated differently, because they would lead to very similar consequences in terms of externalities and also dangers for yourself. So there's no sensible reason from a normative point of view why you should evaluate two actions that are very close to one another differently. However, because there is a law that defines what is legal and what is illegal, so for example, at this point, then the law says you are intoxicated to a level where it's illegal that you drive, then we might expect that at that point, there is actually discontinuity in the way that the behavior is evaluated. Once you start taking, once you start driving with the level of alcohol that makes you illegally intoxicated, then the judgments that people will make about your behavior will be much harsher than if you were driving with the level of alcohol in your blood, which is just legal. And this discontinuity, if we observe it, we can attribute it to the expressive power of law. So we can explain this discontinuity as being caused by the existence of a law that sets a threshold exactly at that point. Of course, we need to observe a discontinuity exactly at that point. So that's sort of the idea behind the empirical strategy. So what we're going to do is we're going to run experiments in which we assign participants, different participants, to different versions of our vignettes. And these different versions differ in the distance of the behavior that you describe from the legal threshold. So for example, we will have 2 vignettes where the behavior is just legal or just illegal. And then we will have 6 vignettes that are further away from the threshold in either direction. So essentially, we are trying to map out different points of this function using different versions of our vignettes. And also, crucially, we vary the gender or the race of the person that we describe in the vignette. So we will either have a version of the vignette where the person is a man, or is a woman, or is a Black American, or is a white American. And in each case, we ask people how appropriate it is that the person takes a certain behavior. We measure these discontinuities at the threshold, and we measure whether they are different for men and women or for Black and white Americans. So what we're looking at is essentially drawing different functions and checking whether the discontinuity at the threshold that we observe for men is larger or smaller or the same as the discontinuity that we observe for women. And so our identification strategy relies essentially in measuring differences in discontinuities at the legal threshold for people that belong to different subgroups of the population. So which type of behaviors did we study? So we have 2 different studies, one that focus on gender and one that focus on race. For the study that focused on gender, we constructed we measured 6 different types of behavior, the appropriateness of 6 different types of behavior. And we measured this based on the literature that shows that there are gender differences in this domain that we studied. So for example, we have 2 vignettes that have to do with risk. And there's a literature that talks about gender differences in risk taking. So we have, sorry, this risk taking is this one. And so we have a vignette in which people are driving while intoxicated. So we have a person that is driving above or below the blood alcohol limit. And then we have a speeding vignette, another person driving above or below the speed limit. And we vary the gender of the person that we describe in the vignette. In some cases, participants saw that the person driving was a man, and in the other case, that the person driving was a woman. Then we have two vignettes that deal with prosocial behavior. Also here, there's a literature that talks about differences in prosociality between men and women. So we have two vignettes in which a person acts as a gatekeeper that prevents another person to engaging in some behaviors that may be damaging or detrimental for the person. So in one case, we have a shopkeeper who is selling alcohol to a young person, which is either above or below the legal age for drinking. In another case, we have a casino bouncer that admits a person into the casino, and this person that they admit is either above or below the legal age for gambling. So this bouncer and shopkeeper could prevent an externality occurring for another person. So in that sense, they capture prosocial behavior. And then we have two vignettes that instead have to deal with the labor market. So this is sort of to capture the idea, the literature on gender difference in labor market outcomes. So we have a vignette in which a manager offers a wage above or below the federal minimum wage to a job applicant who is either a man or a woman. And then we have a manager who approves unpaid parental leave weeks, either above or below the legally guaranteed leave, to an employee who is either a man or a woman. So these are the 6 vignettes we use for the gender study. For the race study, we don't really have any literature in terms of differences like we have for gender, but we based our vignettes on differences in crime or economic statistics. And so 3 vignettes are actually the same as the one for gender. So drink driving, speeding, and minimum wage. We keep those vignettes the same. The difference here is that now the person that we describe is either a Black American or is a white American. And then we have 3 vignettes that instead are new. One is about gun possession. So we describe a father buying a gun for his son, and the son is either above or below the legal age for gun possession. We have a medical marijuana use vignette. Here we have a user who buys marijuana above or below the legal limit. And then we have an age of consent vignette, where a young man engages in non-forcible sexual activity with a woman who is above or below the age of consent, and we vary whether the woman is a Black American or a white American. The way we manipulate gender and race in the experiment is as we try to strike a balance between making it natural and salient. So in the gender case, we just tell the woman is driving, and then we use the pronouns she, her in the vignette. So that's the way or we say a man is driving. So that's the way we manipulate gender. For Black and for the race study, instead we use names that are racially stereotypical. And we also explicitly say at the beginning of vignette, this person is a Black American or this person is a white American. So in the vignettes, we give some details that are important for people to understand the context of the behavior. So each time we make it clear whether the behavior is legal or not. We also make it clear that the person in the vignette knows this. This is because we don't want to ask people to evaluate the social appropriateness of unintentionally or unknowingly breaking the law. We want them to evaluate law breaking or law following that is conscious from the point of view of the decision maker. So as I said before, we have different versions of the vignettes. We vary the distance from the legal threshold of the behavior, and we also vary the gender or the race of the person taking the behavior. This is a between subject design, so each person only saw one version of these vignettes. So for example, you could have seen a vignette where the person was a woman driving just below the legal speed limit, and you wouldn't have seen any other vignette concerning driving, speed driving. In addition to these vignettes that are the target of our study, we also included the 9 additional vignettes as fillers. And the reason is that we wanted to obfuscate the study objective. We wanted to reduce the salience of legal thresholds. So these other 6 vignettes that people saw always had a legal threshold. We didn't want to make that too salient to our participants. So we added 9 additional vignettes, which either had to do with legal or illegal behavior that was not regulated by legal thresholds, or it was just behavior that was not regulated by law at all. So in total, each person saw 15 vignettes, 9 fillers, and 6 target vignettes in a random order. So we did this experiment on NTurk and Prolific with fairly large group of participants, 2,000 respondents from Texas and 2,000 respondents from Florida. So these are 2 states in the US. The gender study was done in Texas and the race study in Florida. Now you might wonder why these 2 states. So we wanted sort of a fairly large sample. So of course we wanted states that were populous. So we wanted, first of all, to run one study only in one state. And this is because, as you know, some of these laws vary across states. So we wanted to avoid the complication of having to deal with different legal thresholds as we move from one state to another. So we only wanted to run one study in one state. And then Texas and Florida are sufficiently populous that give us the possibility to recruit about 2,000 participants on this online platforms. And we chose, among the populous US states, we chose Texas and Florida because there are existing studies that sort of rank US states based on sexism and racism, and Texas and Florida sort of rank high in these 2 dimensions. So Florida rank relatively higher than other states in terms of how on measures of racism that this paper by Stevens and Davidovitz was based on Google data. And Texas is the same for sexism based on a paper that uses GSS data. So those 2, that's the reason why we focused on these 2 states. Yeah, so as I said, the experiment was done online. So we paid 1 randomly chosen vignette across the 15. And people were paid according to the Krupka-Weber method. So they were only paid if they matched the opinion, the evaluation by most people in the same treatment. So let me show you the results. So I'm going to show you results using these figures. The fit is a bit similar to the figure I showed you earlier. So I'm going to plot on the y-axis the mean appropriateness rating in this Krupka-Weber method. So 1 is very appropriate, -1 is very inappropriate. 0 means the behavior is neither appropriate nor inappropriate. And then on the y-axis, I'm going to plot, I have this running variable that measures the distance of the behavior described in the vignette from the legal threshold. So for example, here the casino vignette, I think the legal age was 21-year-old. I might be wrong here, but imagine this was 21-year-old, the legal age for entering the casino. So then you have that this is the legal threshold, and then the behavior where the person is below 21 years of age is illegal. So this will always be on the right side of the screen. Instead, the behaviors where the person is above the legal age are legal. So you will see functions that go from legal to illegal as we move from the left to the right of the screen. And I will plot 2 different functions. In this case, we are in the gender study. So I will plot a norm function for women and a norm function for men. So this is how it looks like. So we have this 8 points in each graph. Remember, we gave people different versions of the vignette, in which the person that was admitted into the casino was 1, 3, 5, or 7 days above the legal age for being admitted into the casino, or 1, 3, 5, or 7 days below the legal age. So they hadn't yet been turned 21. And we did this for men and for women. And so what you can see here, for example, for the casino vignette is a pattern that is very typical of the vignettes that we ran. So what you observe is that for behavior, behavior that is legal is evaluated as appropriate, behavior that is illegal is evaluated as inappropriate. But also what you see importantly is that the passage of time for behavior that is legal or behavior that is illegal doesn't really matter for the evaluation of appropriateness. So this is in line with our intuition about the continuity of this norm function for small, for actions that are very close to one another. What makes a big difference is whether the behavior turns from being legal to being illegal. So here the casino bouncer is admitting a person that is legally admitting a person into the casino or not. And this creates this huge drop in the appropriateness evaluations from 0.75 to minus 0.25. And this, of course, this drop is highly significant. And this shows you these discontinuities I was talking about earlier that we interpret as the influence that laws have on norms. Laws shape the norm function by creating these jumps around these legal thresholds. The same happens also for the other vignette. Here, this is about the shopkeeper selling alcohol to a young person. Again, we don't see anything happens on either side of the legal threshold, but we see this jump as the shopkeeper sell the alcohol to someone who is legally entitled to buy alcohol from someone to someone who is not legally entitled to buy alcohol. And the other thing that you should see here, and this is the point of the paper, is that there's two functions that we draw for men or women. So remember, the one for men means that the person here being admitted to the casino the person here, that the bouncer is a man that admits a young person into a casino, and the red line is the bouncer is a woman that admits the young person to the casino. So you see that these two norm functions are really similar to one another. And in fact, we don't detect any statistically significant difference in the discontinuity at the legal threshold between the norm function for men or for women. And the same goes for the shopkeeper vignette. Whether the shopkeeper is a man or as a woman doesn't make a difference in the way that people evaluate behavior, and importantly, doesn't make a difference in the way that people evaluate this drop in appropriateness as the behavior becomes illegal. This is a result that is very common across all our vignettes. So I'm presenting you lots of null results today, because we do observe essentially no very little differences in the way that people evaluate behavior of men or women or black or white Americans. So this is the vignettes for risky behavior, speeding and drink driving. Here again, you see the two functions overlap to a very large extent, so there's not much of a difference. One interesting point to observe here is that for these two types of behavior, we don't observe very large discontinuities. So if you compare with the one I just showed you earlier, you can see that this drop in the function, this jump in the function as we move from legal to illegal behavior is very, very small compared to those other two. And this is sort of a result that is we've found in many different studies, including also in the UK, where we ran a similar set of experiments. It seems that this driving behavior or risky behavior, perhaps, it seems that here the law does not have such a strong expressive power as it has elsewhere. So it seems that the influence that the law exerts on the norms is much smaller for these types of behavior related to driving than for other types of behavior. Which is an interesting finding.
Can I interrupt you for a second and ask a question that's in the chat box that I think is relevant for these graphs? Yes. So what was the reference group that everyone was compared to? Like, was this the US population in general, or the state population, or something more specific?
That's a good question. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, people were told that so I assume that what you mean by reference group is who they were trying to coordinate with when they were doing this Kruker-Weber task. They were told that they were coordinating. Say, if you were a person that was taking this experiment on Enter, you would have been told that you were coordinating with other Enterkers who were registered in the same state as you were registered. So here, for example, would have been Texas. So here you would have been told that you have to coordinate with other Enterkers from Texas that are evaluating this vignette, which is about Texas. So we were using the laws that apply in Texas. So that was the reference group.
A second question that I don't know if you know the answer. Are casinos legal in Texas?
Sorry?
Are casinos even legal in Texas?
Well, there are casinos in Texas, so I assume they are legal. So yeah, there are casinos in Texas. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether they have to have some special status, like they have to be on special parts of the land. There might be something like that, but there are casinos in Texas. So yeah. Right. So yeah, labor market behavior, again, we observe something similar. So in the minimum wage, so here, remember, was a vignette where the employer was paying someone, either a man or a woman, a wage which was either above or below the legal minimum wage. And again, the employer is evaluated much more harshly as soon as he pays the people below the minimum wage. But again, this discontinuity does not vary between men and women. Same for parental leave. Parental leave may be slightly interesting because we observe this sort of shift, this sort of parallel shift in the function for men and women. So it seems that giving very little parental leave to a woman is considered worse than giving it the same amount of parental leave to a man. But in terms of the size of these discontinuities at the legal threshold, we don't see any significant difference here. So again, throughout the gender study, we don't see any difference in the discontinuities of these norm functions at the legal threshold. We do the test more formally using a standard regression discontinuity analysis. So I'll skip this for the sake of time. There's nothing really fancy or out of the ordinary here. We just run the standard regression discontinuity analysis. And we find, as I told you, no difference in behavior between vignettes for men and for women. So let me instead move to the race study that we did in Florida. So these are the vignettes for gun possession and marijuana possession. Gun possession, remember, this was a vignette with a father who buys a gun for the son, and the son is either a minor or not. So he is either sort of legally entitled to own a gun or not. And we describe this father as being either a white American or a black American. So you have the two functions over there. And this about gun possession is actually the only vignette in our study where we do see a significant difference in the way that people evaluate behavior at the threshold. So in particular, a white father that buys a gun for a son when the son is not entitled to own a gun is evaluated much more harshly than a father that buys a gun legally for their son. But this drop in the evaluation of the father's behavior is much less pronounced for black fathers. So here it seems that white fathers are evaluated more harshly for engaging in illegal behavior than black fathers are. And this story is broadly consistent with this idea that I was telling you earlier about, what do you believe when you observe someone committing this type of crime? And if you know that this person is a black American or is a white American. So if you believe, for example, that black Americans are incarcerated wrongly more often than white Americans for this type of crime, knowing that the father has a criminal record for illegal gun possession might not give you a lot of information about the type of person that father is, because that signal is very noisy. And instead, the signal might be more precise for a white father because there are less, say, wrongful convictions for them. And so this story is broadly consistent with, this result is broadly consistent with that story, but you have to bear in mind that, we have 12 vignettes where we do this test, and this is the only one in which we find a statistically significant difference. So this might be just by chance. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this result, but I just wanted to give you some interpretation. For the marijuana vignette, we observe a jump at the threshold, but again, no difference between white or black users. Driving behavior, again, we observe these functions that are much less discontinuous than for the other types of behavior that I showed you. These are the same that we see in the gender study. So this result is fairly consistent that the discontinuities here are very small, but we don't see differences for between blacks and whites. And then finally, we have the minimum wage vignette and the age of consent vignette. Here we observe more pronounced discontinuities. But again, the size is identical across the two racial groups. So, and again, the regression analysis shows us exactly what I told you. So what can we conclude from this set of results? So we can conclude that laws do causally influence norms. Often, not always, we've seen that there are some behaviors, in particular this one related to risk-taking when you drive, they seem to be fairly immune to the power of laws, to expressive power of laws. That's sort of interesting. But we also don't see differences in these norm functions across gender. So there's no evidence that the expressive power of the law is heterogeneous across gender or across race. For race, we found one result that might be suggestive of some difference, but as I told you, is 1 out of 12. So one needs to interpret this cautiously. So what are the possible reasons for these null results? I'll just quickly give you an overview of our thinking about how to interpret what these results. So the first one you might think like maybe you lack power to identify this diff in diff. But actually our study are fairly powered. We have 2,000 observations per study. And if we do power analysis, we see that we are sort of powered to detect effects of a size comparable to the effects found in Krupka-Weber. So this is around 20 percentage point shift in the mode of the rating distribution. Is that large? Is that small? It's always very hard to say. It just, if you think about the sort of the framing effect in Krupka-Weber as a reference comparison, we are in that ballpark of effects. We are powered to detect effects of that size. So that's one possible explanation. You might also wonder, maybe the treatment manipulation was weak. You know, you tell people that the person driving is a man or a woman, is a Black American, white American, maybe they forget about this and they immediately focus on behavior and they forget that they're evaluating a man or a woman. So we did a follow-up experiment to test for that. So we wanted to know, do people actually remember that the person is a man or that the person that they're evaluating is a man or a woman? So we asked them, after a random vignette, we ask people to report whether they recall that the gender, what is the gender or the race of the person in the vignette they just evaluated. And we pay them if they were guessing correctly. And we see a very high recall rate. So in gender, 96% could recall the gender of the person, in the race, 74%. So this is much better than chance. So we think that this explanation is unlikely. It seems that people do have in mind that they are evaluating a man or a woman. So this cannot be the reason why we don't see much difference in the way they evaluate their behavior. So another bit more technical reason is that, you know, these differences in the expressive power of the law that I was telling you, we can sort of show that theoretically should emerge. They can have offsetting effects, so they can go in different directions. So for example, if law enforcement discriminates against one group, then, as I told you earlier, criminal record is a noisier signal of the person's type. So the expressive power of the law is weaker. However, if discrimination also implies harsher penalties, so there is sort of systematically harsher sort of penalties against the group that is discriminated against, then this implies a stronger expressive power of the law. So having a criminal record is a worse signal. So you see these two effects can offset one another, which might explain why we don't see empirically a pattern of differences. But the final explanation, this is more speculative, but actually we think is what is going on, but we can't prove it, of course, is that we think that when people evaluate behavior from a social appropriateness point of view, so when people think about social norms, they tend to take the role of impartial spectators, and they tend to think about their evaluation as blind as possible to racial differences or to gender differences. And we think that that's probably explains why this expressive power of law that we observe is gender blind and race blind. Whatever the explanation, I think that the conclusion from the study is that although in theory there are reasons to believe that the expressive power of law may vary across subgroups of the population, and this could explain why these subgroups of the population are over or underrepresented in the criminal justice system, empirically we do not find evidence for that, so this cannot be a primary mechanism for these differences. So I'll stop here. So thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to present this paper, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I see that there are some risen hands in the audience. So Christina, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for, it's very interesting, the study you did. I have a few questions. The first is to equate appropriateness judgment with social esteem. And I wouldn't do that. That's why I don't think that thinking of norms is a good way of presenting this argument. Why? Because a judgment, especially as you focalize people on the legal system, okay, and what is legal and what is illegal, it looks as appropriateness is a function of the distance from the legal thresholds, basically. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so I wouldn't say that, you know, has anything to do with social esteem. If you ask me, you know, there is a law and blah, 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 and how appropriate it is to drive, for example, below a certain statutory driving, you know, distance limit, etc. I will say, you know, my appropriateness judgment will follow, basically.
Yeah, no.
The miles per hour, basically.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. I think, I mean, you're sort of pointing to, yeah, one part of this exercise that is a bit tricky because, you know, I think there is a relation between social esteem and social norms. I think you also talk about it in your work. But it's true that it's different to ask. I mean, in the model of Benabou and Tirole, the inferences are about the type of person that takes a certain behavior, that receives a certain level of esteem. So here we are sort of jumping from inferences about the type of person that takes a certain behavior to the appropriateness of that, how appropriate to evaluate that behavior. So there's I agree there is a non-trivial jump there. In the other paper I was telling you about with Sylvia and Tom, we do have experiments, we do repeat this exercise directly with the type. So in a way, we focus on social esteem more directly, and we see very similar results. So in a way, you know, although, you know, conceptually I agree that we are sort of, yeah, we need to be careful in making this translation between esteem and appropriateness. In empirically, it seems that the two things co-move, or at least sort of they are correlated to quite a large extent, because we see very similar results in when we elicit directly the inference about the type of person that behaves illegally or legally, in terms of their trustworthiness, honesty, and prosociality, and when we ask the appropriateness of behavior. So, which is interesting, I think, as a finding.
The second question is, I think, important, because if you look at other cultures, especially in developing countries, when they pass laws against certain common and consider appropriate behavior, I'm thinking all over Africa, the laws against female genital cutting, for example. And, you know, this is something that has been widely studied, the distance between the norm and the law. Mm-hmm. And so the law certainly has an expressive function, always has an expressive function. But the problem is if there is a norm that approves and condones female genital cutting, the law will never be followed, for example. And there are, if you want, I know, very interesting studies about these bad distance between the law and the norms. And so basically the law has to be more in line with the existing norms.
Yes.
So in this sense, if you measure appropriateness in those situations, and if you give them, you know, the law, either they may say, because, you know, you're asking them, yes, 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 it's very inappropriate or very inappropriate, but in the end, they don't behave according to that. So yes. The question is only in certain cultures, okay, you yes. have a sort of agreement between norms and laws, and not even in our culture, we don't.
I mean,
Yeah, excuse me. Go on.
Our method, in a way, is so it could capture those situations that you're telling us. So this would be a situation in which the law has no power over the norm whatsoever, because the norm is immune to the law, especially if it doesn't agree with the sentiment in society. So I think if we were to apply our method to a situation like you were describing, we would observe probably no effect of the law on the underlying norms. But also what you point out is very important, because it exactly shows that the empirical challenge in studying the effect of the law on the norm, because what you were saying is that, you know, laws often sort of are changed to align with the underlying social norm of a society. So it's very hard to sort of claim a direction of causality empirically, because you have this co-evolution of the two institutions. So in that sense, that the contribution of our design is to show a method in which you can actually, with some reasonable assumptions, you can get that causality, although only for a specific subset of behaviors which are regulated by legal thresholds. So
yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question and just like a request for clarification. So when I think of the expressive power of law, say like in the spirit of Richard McAdams, for example, I think of that as kind of something internal to people's motivations. And here you're not really measuring people's motivation. You're asking about how people perceive others who behave in a certain way. And I'm struggling to differentiate what they what you're trying to measure as the differences in the expressive power of law versus of how people discriminate against each other in those questions. So how do you, like, what's conceptually differentiating that approach from just measuring how we see other people's behavior differently depending on how we discriminate against them?
I think these two things are related, and they are also related to this internal motivation, in the sense that in the framework we are using, what other people think about you is essential to your utility. So if people have a bad opinion of you, then you suffer a disutility, and vice versa if you instead people have a good opinion of you. So in that sense, that motivation that you were talking about comes through the opinion that others have of you. Now, what I think also what you were asking is whether so is it possible that people have sort of some discriminatory view, say, against women or against men, and then they use that when they express their judgment about the appropriateness of certain behavior. That's actually what we were expecting, in the sense that if you can think, you can, in the framework of the model, you can think of this as sort of different priors on the distributions of pro-sociality for men and women. You can think of this as a way to model this discriminatory views we're talking about. And then this should lead to different ways to evaluate the behavior of a man or of a woman, the same behavior for a man or for a woman. But we don't see that, which I think suggests, at least this is the way that we interpret, suggests that people actually set aside this discriminatory view when they think about making appropriateness judgments. That's the sort of the interpretation as the impartial spectator that I was telling you earlier. So they try to be objective, if you see what I mean. Then they might not behave objectively when they actually have to act towards another person. They might discriminate against them. But if you ask them what is appropriate, they try to give you an objective response.
Excuse me, if I may add one thing, which is very important here, and Alex pointed to that. When you put people in a situation in which they have to judge appropriateness against the law, because they know there is a law, of course they judge impartially.
Exactly, yes.
You are not asking them some more general questions, you know, about without the law, appropriateness of certain behavior. Yes. But of course, you want to know the difference, so you have, you know, to tell them what the law is. And in that case, of course, there will be impartiality. You know, it's to be expected. And
yes.
that's
that's a very good point. Very, very good point. Yeah, exactly.
Very
and
good
then, you know,
point.
that doesn't mean that, sorry, go ahead, Alex.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just saying this doesn't mean that actually people might, you know, they might, so this is sort of their sort of cognitive, we get sort of a conscious, a cognitive evaluation of the appropriateness. It might be that then on a sort of unconscious level, they actually then act in a way that is discriminatory. So the bias might be there. It's just that it's not there when you ask people what is appropriate.
So there's a lot of discussion right now that say some laws, say marijuana laws, disproportionately affect people of color in the US. And for the same crime, people of color can be sentenced for way longer sentences than their white peers. And then goes along with the question that was asked in the chat by Eugen Demand. And he's asking, have you actually tried to measure not just people's perception of appropriateness and inappropriateness, but also the sanction that will follow when people break the law? Like, what would be the response of the legal authorities if the person is caught?
Yeah, no, that would be very interesting, but we don't have the data on that. But at some point we were discussing, it would be interesting to do this type of vignettes experiments, perhaps extending it to sanctions with people who are in law enforcement, and they have to decide on this type of things, because that would give you some maybe there is a sort of some type of differences there in the more technical aspects of implementation of the law that could be interesting to explore. But we don't have the data for that, but it would be very interesting, yes.
Daniele, another point here, which is very interesting about what Alex said and the question of Eugen. Remember that the implementation, when you are in court, is a jury that decides. It's not just the judge who says the law is and the punishment is, but it's a jury. And the jury respond to specific norms that may be quite different from, just the limits of the law. They may judge the Black person much more guilty than a white person. And so the appropriateness, etc. In the end, you should measure it not just with that judgment, which is in some sense guided, and impartial, but by the real norm, which is the willingness to punish.
Right. Yes.
How willing you are to punish a certain behavior. That tells me what really the norm
that would be interesting as well.
You should do that. There are lots of data about juries and the composition of juries, and a lot of studies about that. Yes. Even in Texas and Florida, where you're studying.
Right. And this goes back to some of this other explanation about discrimination that we were talking about earlier. So it seems that probably the origins of this bias is in there rather than in the explanation that we proposed. Yeah,
there is a comment from Jinglin in the chat. So maybe we can answer just orally. So she wants to know whether we have tested direct, whether people were asked to provide their own judgment of appropriateness rather than asking, the question related to the group Cabede.
Right. I see. I am reading that. Yeah, no. In this experiment, we didn't. In this paper, we just used the group Cabede. In the other paper that I was mentioning, we do also ask people their own appropriateness. So we elicit both personal norms and the social norms, and the social norms we elicited both with the method of Kruka-Weber and with the method of Christina and Erte, asking sort of to guess what the personal belief of people is. And we find very, very similar results. So in that sense, in this case, the pluralistic ignorance doesn't seem to play a big role for the behaviors we study. But that's obviously depends on the context. But for the behaviors we study, we see very, very similar results.
But if I can give you an advice, instead of saying a norm is a function and blah, 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 the normative attitudes, right. Because you're measuring normative attitudes, normative social attitudes, basically. And you're not measuring a norm, really, because the empirical component is not there.
Yeah, so
but you're measuring something. And I would make very clear this, the fact that you are offering them, in a sense, a focal point, which is what the law is. And then they sort of converge. And impartially, that's which is the problem, you know, that I have with the Krupp-Weber measurement, because there is always some sense of offering, you know, the focal point. Which
that's why in this other paper we used also your method, which sort of doesn't suffer from that criticism. Because you don't have the coordination aspect in it. So that's the reason why we also use the other method.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time. We're going to share the chat with everyone, so it's transcribed and recorded. And then, is there a link that people can follow to read more about this study, or is the presentation going to be available so that those who had more questions can follow read it through and follow up with you?
Yeah, I can. I mean, we don't have I was talking about the paper, or we don't have the paper yet. So it's an imaginary paper for now, but I can share the slides.
If you can share the slides,
we can tell me how to share the slides. I can send you the slides. Perfect.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting and very relevant to present day things.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We'll see you in 2 weeks with the next talk.